Canadian Nuclear Laboratories' proposal for a near-surface disposal facility, or NSDF, is a responsible solution for low-level waste that will be generated from the cleanup mission at Chalk River. Let's move this environmental solution forward. Say yes to NSDF. Visit the Virtual Visitor Centre at engagewithcnl.ca/NSDF to learn more and how you can support this initiative. We encourage you to have your say.
Everybody, welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. This is a post-budget podcast as of about an hour post the budget. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me I have
Vince Versace, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce.
This is going to be our kind of real quick hit look at the budget overall views on TCR Express. We're probably going to have a couple of the other reporters on. Well, they have put more of a deep dive into all various aspects of the budget. I would say my first impression is that they're definitely spending money, but this is one of those vague budgets where they don't exactly tell you what they're spending on. They kind of do, but they don't drill down like they have in a couple previous ones where they say, well, yes, we're building this, that, and the other thing. This is more, we're doing this stuff, which will lead to building things.
Well, that's, you know, how we always try to think of snazzy headlines and snazzy, catchy things. And what strikes me after an hour of just kind of looking at this, and I think it's a building block budget. I think we're going to hear that, right? Like we have a federal government now that is secure in its place in Ottawa for the next, you know what I mean, for this whole term, right? Especially thanks to that NDP deal. They don't have to worry about presenting an election type budget. Like I think about it, Warren, like when you and I have been in Ottawa in the lockup, and when I've had other of our reporters in the past in the lockup, in those election years or those pre-election years, like 2 years out, you can tell what that budget is. It has those kind of key, big, flashy spends, and we're going to do this, and we're going to change this and invest that. My initial impression is this is a building block. They feel secure that they can build towards stuff and not do any kind of type of panic spending or moves to garner votes.
One thing I found interesting, and although it wasn't really a surprise to anybody, was they put a lot of money into defense. And I was watching CBC while they were covering the budget, and David Cochran mentioned the Ukrainian invasion happened during them planning for the budget, so they had to sort of reorient around that. And so they put $8 billion into defense spending. Interestingly, when I was looking through the budget, a lot of that is new spending, but it's built on a plan they put out in 2017 of how they're, for the next 20 years, defense spending is going to go. So it's on top of what they're already spending. And so it's stuff like, I think, just off the top of my head, reorienting and changing the leadership, because there's been a lot of scandals in terms of that with the and in terms and more inclusion, and which actually does lead to building, because if they're going to sort of reorient things and make things a little more welcoming, they've got to rebuild things in a different way. They've got to have, you know, gender inclusive bathrooms, just to take one example. You still got to build that, right? There's all sorts of little things they got to build towards. They also talked about cybersecurity, and that means building data centers, you know, or at least building extra capability into what you're doing.
And I mean, the military spending is always of interest to us, just like in some of the areas you've highlighted. But when we've had previous plans about, you know, shipbuilding, especially in the naval yards, in the Maritimes, you know, it's like, okay, well, that's skilled trades work, right? The building of ships, the building of submarines, and what does that mean for work in our industry? And at a time when we're seeing the change in the Alberta oil sands, and we still see workers, you know, leaving Alberta and going back to their home provinces, you have a certain skill set that's available, and I'm sure would be keen to get building somewhere, whether it's on the West Coast or the East Coast, right? With that type of equipment, you know, the labor is there, right?
They also talked about sort of, and this is originally part of the plan too, but they sort of recommitted to it, building up NORAD, especially since Russia is the villain du jour in the world, and they're right above us. That NORAD means, which is pretty old infrastructure. You'd think that would also mean building up new infrastructure. But I was actually talking to Daily News editor Lindsay Cole offline about this. I was saying, well, the last thing they're going to say, here's our showcase installation, is a defense project. They're just not going to talk about those until they absolutely have to. And there's, you know, a whole lot behind that, procurement and just national security. Unlike, say, we're building a dam or we're building a series of hospitals, here they've got to be circumspect into what they actually say they're building for a whole bunch of reasons that have nothing to do with the budget.
It's true. Like I think back to budgets where I sat there under the Harper government, where they talked about like kind of these deep sea ports in the north,
Hmm.
right, to help contribute to the defense of the north and the Northern Passage, and making sure our territorial claims as a nation in Canada can be defended
Hmm.
and be legitimate almost because you have then the structures there. I think that's for a newsroom that's probably beyond our time, maybe a bit
Hmm.
here
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
DC
totally.
and OGLC by the time we see that build out. But I'm sure climate
Hmm.
change, which we are going to talk about here in a little bit, climate change is pushing some of that. Some of those
Hmm.
decisions are going to have to be real, and construction will play a part. Engineering will play a part in the north, and that defense infrastructure that we need to build there. But like you're saying, it's not going to be a big splashy stuff on
No,
kind of the
no.
key critical security stuff. You
Also, $8
know,
billion
so
dollars is a big deal for us, but
yes,
it's a couple days in the States. So
it-
so just to keep it in perspective, that's nothing money in the States.
it's true. And but also like when we think about some of the big infrastructure projects we cover, right?
Hmm.
$8 billion. How big is that really? You know, on some
Site
major,
Cs are in that neighborhood, yeah.
yeah, exactly, right. So, but you mentioned climate. I mentioned climate change, and you know, the like we know our industry. We're starting to see the change. They want to become, well, I guess to speak for everybody, but the sense that we get through our stories is
Mhm.
there is a willingness to approach resiliency around climate change and building for the future and building better. Right. Like just recently, we had our climate change and construction feature, our first national climate change and construction feature. And we see that across the nation. There is a willingness to experiment and try, you know, vertical forests, you know,
Mhm.
and building smarter and better and training better. Um, what did we see here in this budget at all around climate change?
Well,
Did you see any type of?
yeah,
Go ahead.
they put 2.6 billion over 5 years to finance an investment tax credit for businesses for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Which again, that's speaking directly to Alberta and to a lesser extent other provinces, but definitely Alberta. So that's a lot of money for carbon capture. Which up until let's say 5 years ago, nobody was sure if it would work. And now the government's putting a
Mhm.
bunch of money towards it. So.
Right. And in tied with that too is there's the we've been seeing the movement here in Ontario, which is interesting with Premier Doug Ford. You know, one of the first things he did when he came to power was eliminate the incentives around electrical vehicle purchases,
Mhm.
kind of stalled a bit of the momentum that was being built up in the province around the infrastructure for electrical vehicles. And now, of course, with the provincial election soon around the corner, yes, I'm editorializing a bit, but the facts are the facts. It's obvious. All of a sudden, we're seeing announcements around
Mhm.
electric vehicle infrastructure and plants and assembly plants being built here in Ontario. Did we see stuff in the federal budget
Yeah.
around that?
The federal government is going to extend incentives and extending eligibility to entice more Canadians to buy electric cars, trucks, vans, SUVs, and that'll cost 1.7 billion over 5 years. But that means you're building or reorienting plants for electrical vehicles, which in Ontario is a big deal, and Quebec too, I would assume.
Yeah, yeah, massive. Like you know what I mean. And we kind of start to see it's like there is the thirst for
Mhm.
people to want to go electric. It's the incentives are there as far as vehicles, but also to know that the infrastructure is there for them to charge
Mhm.
their car, right?
Which
And to
it
charge
isn't
up
yet.
and
I can
to
tell you in Vancouver, it's not there yet. And Vancouver's supposedly a pretty green
Mhm.
city, but and not that I don't have an electric vehicle, so it hasn't been a real big going concern for me. But there
Mhm.
aren't enough plugins from what I can tell, at least not yet. And you'd think we'd be on the forefront of that.
Yeah. So I guess any incentive, if the federal government's investing in that, there is a trickle down effect to construction. Well, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? Whether it's the trades that are involved in installing those type of installations or the firms that know how to incorporate them as retrofits into
Mhm.
older buildings, right? Well, that's pretty cool on that front. So we got electric cars, we got some climate change stuff. But one of the key things that I found that I was looking for, and it's because of the pandemic, and you and I have been discussing it on this pod before, and
Mhm.
some of our guests have, it's the supply chain.
Mhm.
The supply chain crunch, you know what I mean, is a real thing. It's impacting a lot of people besides the actual pandemic itself. Um, I see that in the budget here. There's a $450 million dedicated over 5 years to unclog supply chains. What does that mean? Is $450 million enough to do that over 5 years? I think this is an angle we have to dive in a little deeper. I'm
Mhm.
curious to see what our stakeholders say on that. I'm curious to see what our resident chief economist, Alex Carrick, has to say about that.
And the
You
supply
know,
chain
so
itself, besides the pandemic, it's also a lot of stuff used to come from Russia. A lot less is going to come from Russia now, and that very general neighborhood. So that's another way you're going to have to unclog or reorient the supply chain.
Yeah, so we endeavor and commit to our listeners who are catching this pod that we will have a bit more on that as we dive
Hmm.
a little deeper, and our reporters do a bit more of the legwork, and and I'm sure the stakeholders are going to tell us enough as well. The ones that have been on the supply chain band, that I call bandwagon, beating the supply chain drum and the issues
Hmm.
around it. I'm sure they're going to have some thoughts on whether that's enough or not, or is it enough maybe to incentivize the provinces to do their part too? Who knows, but we'll see. Um, well, what
And
do you think about? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, speaking of supply, the housing supply
Mhm.
was the
Here we go.
that was no this was no surprise to anybody, but it was that was they're spending 10 billion on home building across a series of initiatives. They're also pledging to double the pace of new homes to 400K annually that the government itself is going to build to target supply, and they're doing a temporary ban on foreign buyers and a crackdown on speculators, all of which was kind of in the works before, but now it's for sure in the works. I think it's 2 years for foreign buyers, and I don't remember off the top of my head how long the crackdown or if it's permanent on speculators is going to be.
Mhm. Massive issue. Talk about the other drum that's been beat a lot by provincial people that we know in the industry and also on a national level is the housing crisis and how to address it and the role construction has in it. I know here in Ontario we got groups like Rescom that have been very active on that file, trying to actually
Mhm.
get affordable housing built. Not housing built that is going to go to the highest, what I mean, bidder, but actually housing to actually help families. You know what I mean? Medium income families, working class families, getting that supply up. So it's good to see the federal government putting in because people sometimes point to, hey, what's the Fed? What are the Feds doing? Right? Though housing usually is a provincial jurisdiction, right? And it's typically really impacted by at the municipal level around planning,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. Yeah. Mhm.
So we'll be curious to see what the industry has to say on the housing stuff. But those are encouraging numbers. We would think at first blush, just an hour after looking at
Mhm.
it. So then when talking about dollars, we came across this note that basically it seems like the federal government's going to be forcing provinces to allocate $7.3 billion in outstanding infrastructure dollars by next March or lose it.
Mhm.
Curious to see what that is. You know what I mean? I want to dive a bit more deeper into the back end of the budget and see what we're talking about and see what the background. We'll probably have to do some a bit more legwork through our reporters and ourselves to find out what that is. You know what I mean? Is it from a particular fund? Is it stuff that? How long has that stuff been sitting there outstanding? you
Mhm.
know, and the provinces haven't used it. And to our conversation, to the point we talked about 10 minutes ago, $7.3 billion is a lot, but when it comes to infrastructure, how much is it really when you're looking at it at a national scale, right? So be curious to see to use the term, unpack that, as some people
Mhm.
say, and see what it actually means and what the provinces are going to say in reaction to that.
Another thing to do with housing is that they've put an additional 11 billion over 6 years for Indigenous children, families, and communities, and 4 billion of that is going to housing. When another 4 billion is for health, social, and educational services, and you got to think that clean water is definitely going to be part of that, which is infrastructure. So that's more
Mhm.
money that I mean they planned for this before, but it sounds like they're following through and adding some money to it, which is good.
Yeah. I mean, one day I would love in our lifetime, Warren, just to have a government write the biggest ticket, the biggest check possible just
Oh
to deal
yeah,
with this water crisis.
exactly. That's
Just build the heavy
ridiculous.
civil stuff and get it done.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm comfortable editorializing on this point for our
Yeah, I
listeners.
don't think that's
And
a
I'm sure
problem.
most of them see it the same way. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
We're Canada.
I
And,
found the
these
numbers.
reserves.
It
Yeah, I'll
said
go ahead. Tell us.
four
Yeah.
hundred million for 2 year over 2 years for infrastructure on reserves, and 247 million of that is going to go to wastewater and water infrastructure. So, like you said, yeah, I mean that's
Mm,
honestly not enough, frankly, but that's
no,
as I
but, and
editorialized.
that it's true. And we can say, well, it's a start, but I've been saying that for budgets now, I don't know how many years. Well, it's something. Credit to this government for what it's worth. It's tried to tackle the
Mm,
boil water advisories as probably as aggressively as we've seen. I think in your lifetime, my lifetime of covering federal
yep,
politics,
I would think so. Yeah,
I can say that in a blanket way, a blanket statement. But one day I would just love to see that big fat check written and just get this
mm,
dealt with because it's not right on so
no,
many things as it concerns the indigenous file, as we know. Like people deserve clean water. You live in Canada,
mhm,
right? Like
yeah,
it's a pretty
exactly.
basic principle. you know. But speaking of Indigenous folks, and I haven't seen enough in the budget, so apologies to the listeners. I do want to dive a bit more to see what money has been allocated around labor and skilled trades, because we talk about
Yeah.
the underrepresented groups and what federal incentives or programs were introduced or are being rolled out to help incentivize provinces and training centers. It would be curious to see what comes of that, because like we know what the Canadian Construction Association and other stakeholders have said, 22% of construction's workforce is retiring over the next decade.
Mhm.
That is a scary number. And if we want to build as much as we want to build, where are those bodies going to come from?
Yeah, exactly. And this isn't related to construction per se, but the dental care thing, which everybody else knew about. I mean, that's kind of a labor issue. Like that means money that
Mm-hmm.
people don't have to spend on the business side of things, and that people who, let's say, they're temporary workers or they're only part time. Well, at some point by 2025, I think is when it's going to cover everybody. They won't have to worry about dental care being a thing because it'll just be covered by the government. So there's some debate and back and forth that could happen there, but they pledged 5.3 billion over 5 years to this.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, something, it has to be something. It's going to help families beyond when we look at stuff beyond our lens of construction. When we look at this budget, it's going to help families, right? Like, I mean, at some point when they get to a pharmacare plan, that we hear, that's much ballyhooed and spoken about, these are the things that are going to help families. And, we just hope that the government see it through, whatever the stripe, right? So
I was
I
actually
don't
saying
have,
to Russell Hickson offline that
mm,
if they introduce it, it's never going away. No,
yes.
no government after this, no matter what stripe they may be, is going to be able to get rid of
Mm,
it. So now it's here. That's that. You got to deal with it one way or the other.
yes, that's right. Well, I don't have much else, but is there anything else you want to add
No,
about
I
what you
think
saw
yeah, I
so
think
far from your
I'm in the same boat you are. It's been like an hour and a half, and I mostly read the defense part because that's what I was writing a story about, and I sort of
Mm,
skimmed over the rest. But we will have more coming up on Wednesday. We're probably going to talk to Don Wall, Angela Gismondi, and Russell Hickson, all of whom have been writing stories, which you'll see in the next couple of days. So, Vince, do you have anything else to add?
No, other than once again, as always, I thank our listeners for following us. I thank our readers for reading. We want to, provide you the best intel and the best construction news that's out there. So, visit us at dcnonl.com or joconl.com. Starting tomorrow, meaning today, actually, tonight's Thursday night, but starting
Hmm.
Friday morning, for your construction related React stories and deeper dives into this budget. And with that, I thank everyone.
Yes, thank you.